أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum dear students. I hope and wish all of you would be doing fine and you would be having great time along with your families. I hope all of you are familiar with the university decision regarding initiation of online classes because of the continuation of closure of academic institutes all around Pakistan. So from tomorrow onward, we would be having regular lectures, and if you have any queries, you would ask me, you could send your queries to me in the WhatsApp group which we have established earlier, and the LMS system which has been launched by the university. It's almost operational now, and your login IDs along with your passwords would be given to you by tomorrow probably, or day after tomorrow. So without wasting further time, we would start our today's lecture. And in our previous lecture discussions, we have talked about the very basics of diplomacy, its various types and its functions, and the various actors involved in diplomacy. So public diplomacy as one of the types of diplomacy will be our today's topic for discussion, and we would have a thorough discussion about public diplomacy because of its emerging significance in the international politics nowadays. And I would try to cover a part of this discussion today, and in our upcoming lectures we would be we would have discussions about the rest part of this lecture. So today we will talk about public diplomacy as a new foreign policy paradigm. As all of you are familiar with, diplomacy is one of the tools or methods to achieve the objectives of the foreign policy. So we will have discussions about public diplomacy as a new foreign policy paradigm. Soft power and public diplomacy have become a buzzword in international politics. Despite the fact that the idea of soft power and public diplomacy has attracted considerable attention all around the globe, yet the concepts, actors, approaches, and practices of both the dynamic concepts remained ambiguous. Public diplomacy, which carried the soft image of a nation, is somewhat naive to majority of academia, diplomatic scholars, and practitioners all around the world. Initially, the term public diplomacy was considered as the jurisdiction of state domain only. However, with the increased number of international actors, the non-state actors legitimately played the role in the working of public diplomacy. So in our today's lecture, we would try to the following aspects of public diplomacy. At first, we would try to conceptualize public diplomacy, and in the next step we will be differentiating public diplomacy from the associated terms, and in the next part we would try to identify the methods and actors associated with the dynamics of public diplomacy, and finally we will try to highlight or explore the challenges and prospects of the very concept of public diplomacy in the modern era. So we would start with the very introduction of public diplomacy. 21st century is termed as the century of soft power, and this very term of soft power was coined for the very first time by Joseph Nye, and he's been famous all around the world because of his very contribution in the types of powers. Like, he has also introduced the concept of smart power. So the concept has attracted and infiltrated in the entire world. It has been thoroughly discussed in all around the world in the academic circles nowadays. The developed countries in particular, as they have resources and expertise in terms of researchers, scholars, and diplomatic practitioners, they immediately followed the public diplomacy and started practicing and adopting new techniques to of public diplomacy. It is considered as one of the best means to achieve public foreign policy objectives of a country. As we have discussed earlier, that it is diplomacy in general is one of the very significant instruments of conducting the business of foreign policy. So public diplomacy as a new innovation in the domains of diplomacy, it has become a very significant concept, and which has been thoroughly practiced both by the developed world and by the developing states all around the world to conduct the business of foreign policy. Now, the narrow concept of diplomacy, which is state to state relations, have been changed, and new actors, issues, and concepts have j- joined the ranks of diplomatic system. This has further facilitated the conceptual development of the term of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is somewhat new to the developing world. Scholars, practitioners, and citizens. Also, among the developed countries, there is no consensus as far as the definition of the term is concerned. So, both in the developed world and in the developing world, there is a lack of consensus over unanimous or over a common or commonly agreed definition of public diplomacy. Different people define public diplomacy differently, while others differ as far as the mechanism is concerned, while for others there are different actors to argue upon. Presently, the debate of diplomacy does not center on the role, kind, or strategies of diplomacy. Now, those who are associated with diplomacy in any form or in any capacity, they argue about the relevance and the role of hard power, which is quite the opposite of soft power, and the role of public in diplomacy and public diplomacy in the 21st century. So, still, public diplomacy is exploring its horizons, and there is too much debate going on around about the conception of the public diplomacy in the world. So, keeping that aspect of the lacking of consensus over the definition of the term public diplomacy, now we would come up with various definitions of public diplomacy which have been given by renowned scholars from the world. So we would start with the Joseph Nye ideas about the concept of soft power. He's of the opinion that other than military and economy, there is soft power which helps the government to achieve its foreign policy aims. So, according to him, there are not only two things which contribute or which deals or which helps the state to develop its foreign policy objectives. There is another thing that comes in the domain of soft power, like, or we can say in the domain of public diplomacy, that helps the government to achieve their foreign policy objectives. So, according to Joseph Nye, he describes the public diplomacy in the following words: one can affect others' behavior in three ways. So, according to him, the behavior of a state can be affected by three different ways. The first is like that involves carrot and stick phenomena. So, threat of coercion, in the form of sticks, is one way to affect the state's behavior, other states' behavior, and inducements and payments in the form of carrots is the other form to to influence other states' attitude or behavior towards that particular state. And final one is the attraction that makes others want what you want. So that is something which is very much related to the business or the network of public diplomacy. Nye believes that soft power rests on multiple aspects like culture, political values, institutions, and foreign policies. Thus, art, literature, architecture, media, education system, politics, vibrant civil society, tourism, and much more can contribute in this soft power image of a country. So, as a student of international politics, we are supposed to be familiar with one aspect, that is prestige. And countries are very much conscious about the element of prestige when it comes to international politics. States always try to project their positive image in the international community, so they utilize different channels to portray a positive image of a country, and public diplomacy is one of the ways or one of the channels through which the states around the world, they try to project their positive image in the eyes of the international public. So these are the different aspects of a country which matters when we talk about projecting a soft power image of a country. In that context, I would like to quote the example of China's threat theory, like which has been propagated by the West throughout the world, especially in the East Asian region. With China's rise in terms of economy and military modernization, it has been projected by the West in the international media that China is a threat to the survival or to the sovereignty of the neighboring countries. So, an effort has been made by the US to create a sort of impression about the Chinese rise and power in different countries around the world by projecting its education system, its politics, its values, its human rights and sovereignty, the philosophical ideas which they project. So these are the things which matter when we talk about projecting a softer image of a country in the eyes of the rest of the world. Nye, in his book Soft Power, identified the differences between high and popular culture. He also clarified that soft power is not only about entertainment and popular culture, but the universal values that a country's culture have and shared by the others also, like human rights, democracy, market economy, equality, and rule of law. They are of immense significance when we talk about projecting a softer image of a country. Similarly, narrow domestic policies and foreign agenda can undermine this softer image of a nation. So right now, Russia, China, Japan, Spain, European Union, Germany, Singapore, Malaysia are some of the countries that are very much involved in conducting public diplomacy successfully by utilizing the soft power concept into reality. However, the success of soft image of any country depends upon the accomplishment of its public diplomacy as a tool of communication, tool of effective communication. So, talking about some other definitions of public diplomacy involving some other dimensions of states' activities. Public diplomacy is considered as a platform from where one can initiate its soft power policies. However, there is no agreed definition of the term public diplomacy. It can be defined as engaging foreign audience to achieve the desired foreign policy goals. So one of the aspects, the dominant aspects of the business of public diplomacy is to involve or engage foreign audience to achieve the desired outcome of foreign policy. So according to Edmund A. Gullion, he was a former dean of the Fletcher School, and he was the first who is considered, he is the one who is considered as the pioneer of the term, and he coined this very term in 1965. According to him, public diplomacy deals with the influence of public attitudes on the formation and execution of foreign policies. It encompasses dimensions of international relations beyond traditional diplomacy, like the cultivation by governments of public opinion in other countries, the interaction of private groups and interest in one country with those of another, the reporting of foreign affairs and its impact on policy, communication between those whose job is to communicate, as between diplomats and the foreign correspondents, and the process of intercultural communication. So, briefly speaking, central to public diplomacy is the transnational flow of information and ideas. So Edmund Gulen, he captured some of the other aspects of public diplomacy into a definition, which has been highlighted with in this very definition. So moving forward, we would like to have some one or two other definitions of public diplomacy. So according to Nicholas J. Cull, he describes public diplomacy in the following words. According to him, public diplomacy is an international actor's attempt to manage the international environment through engagement with the foreign public. So, like one of the definitions which we have just mentioned before, in that definition the aspect of engaging foreign public was highlighted. So, in this very definition given by Nicholas Jekyll, he also involves this very aspects of public diplomacy. So, according to Henriksen, uh, he served as a professor of diplomatic history. According to him, public diplomacy may be defined simply as the conduct of international relations by governments through public communication media and through dealings with a wide range of non-governmental entities such as political parties, corporations, trade associations, labor unions, educational institutions, religious organizations, ethnic groups, and so on, including influential individuals for the purpose of influencing the policies and actions of other governments. So, in this very definition, we can figure out that some like actors out of the sphere of state, some non-state actors has been incorporated into the network of conducting public diplomacy. So political parties, corporations, trade unions, and other religious or ethnic groups, and even the influential individuals can play a very effective role in the public diplomacy to get the foreign policy objectives. So these were the some these were some of the definitions which have been selected to conceptualize the very term public diplomacy. Over the time, people related to the field of diplomacy coined different definitions and broadened the conceptual scope of public diplomacy. The above definitions revealed that public diplomacy is concerned with following elements which we will highlight now. So first of all, we can see that listening to foreign audience, this is one of the elements which the public diplomacy is very much concerned with. So listening to foreign audience before making and executing foreign policies, like this is one of the key aspects of like of the business of public diplomacy. And the second one is to related to the foreign policy goals. As we have already studied about the objectives of diplomacy, the one key objective of diplomacy is to achieve the objectives of foreign policy or to achieve the goals of foreign policy. So the public diplomacy is one of the latest innovations in the sphere of diplomacy, which is used as one of the key tools to get the targets of foreign policy of a country. Another element is the intercultural communication. So the intercultural communication is one of the significant aspect of public diplomacy, and this aspect has been heavily emphasized in public diplomacies which are being conducted by different countries around the world, just to project the positive image of a country in the eyes of the international public, or the in the projecting country's message. It's a long the next element is like it is a long term process. So this public diplomacy, it is a slow and steady process, but its impact is far reaching, and we can say a long lasting, it has a long lasting impact, because the some in this very in the business of public diplomacy, a cultural aspects have been we can say have been focused, and like cross cultural communications have been fastened in this very network of public diplomacy among the states. And it also involves some academic exchange, like academic exchange between countries involved in the business of public diplomacy. So overall it's a slow and steady process, but it has a lasting impact as compared to the other types of diplomacy. The next one is like approaches are carved out according to the situation and demand. So we can say that it has a lot of room for flexibility. So keeping the changing situation and circumstances in mind, this the various aspects of public diplomacy can be easily molded. So it keeps on, the approaches which are being utilized in this public diplomacy are kept on changing by the changing circumstances and demands of a particular country. In the later part of our lecture, we will talk about the various approaches of public diplomacy as well. The next one is the ultimate aim is to manage international environment. So this is again one of the key aspects of the international politics. States involved in the business of foreign policy and diplomacy, they always try to manage the international system. They try to maintain peace, or they try to maintain cordial, if they try to avoid conflictual relationships with other countries, just to advance their national interest. Different and effective means of communication to be utilized. So this is the one area which needs to be like discussed in detail here. So because of the revolution in the age of communication nowadays, so many different channels have been utilized by people around the world for communication, for effective and fast communication. Social media is one of the latest innovations in this very domain of communication revolution, and it has been, the social medias are heavily emphasized by different countries around the world to utilize them for the betterment or for advancing their national interest in the international community or in the overseas countries. And one of the latest innovation is the introduction of state sponsored Twitter accounts, which are being effectively utilized by the major powers around the world such as China and US. Another aspect is another element which is concerned with the business of public diplomacy is that it is open and based on reliable information. Some people conceive it as another form of propaganda, but it is quite different from propaganda in terms because it is based on reliable information. If you happen to follow the Chinese official Twitter accounts, and if you happen to have discussion or have, if you happen to follow the tweets launched from that channel, you will come to know that different media conferences reports and different organizational reports and policy reports have been published from that channel, and you can easily check the authenticity of those reports and by yourself by having access to those first hand information channels. So another aspect is it must have comprehensible message and goals and strategies. So this network of public diplomacy should involve comprehensive message and it should involve a comprehensive system of communication and strategies. It's a concept revolving around branding a nation. That is another key aspect of public diplomacy, or we can say that this is another term which is being utilized synonymously for public diplomacy. Like it's one of the purpose of public diplomacy is branding a nation, to project a positive image of a country in the eyes of the international community, to make it like a brand. And as we can easily conceive that it must be a credible thing, or the information which will be propagated through public diplomacy or shared through public diplomacy channels of public diplomacy, it must be credible. And the last one is it's a two-way process. So when we talk about the very basics of diplomacy is an art of communication, as we all know. So communication involves a two-way phenomena, like a two-way process. Communications cannot just simply happen in a one-way process. It must be a two-way process. That's how communication is conducted among different people. So it must be a two-way process. So these are the various dimensions which are concerned with or the we can say the different aspects which are concerned with public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is simply based on facts and persuasive policies. It is all about worldwide streaming of ideas and information. Okay, now we will talk about, like, move one step further, and now we will talk about new public diplomacy. So, public diplomacy is considered as a paradigm shift, which was later termed as a transformational diplomacy by Condoleezza Rice, a former Secretary of State of the United States, in 2006. On the other hand, scholars prefer to use the term new public diplomacy because of the following factors, which we will discuss now. So, when we talk about the new public diplomacy, new and more actors became part of the diplomatic mission. So, in our previous class discussions, we have talked about, the various aspects of or the characteristics of traditional diplomacy, in which only the state officials used to be involved for conducting the business of foreign policy. But in the modern diplomacy, which can be compared with the new public diplomacy as well, a lot of new actors, both state and non-state actors, have been included for conducting the diplomatic mission, and or they have become a part of diplomatic system. The second thing is, the second factor is, it's about people to people contact. So we, as we all, while we were trying to define the various definitions of public diplomacy, one of the aspect which was dominant over there, it was about people to people contact. And people to people contact have been heavily emphasized in the new public diplomacy. New and faster means of communication developed. We just had a thorough discussion about this few minutes ago, that because of the revolutions in the field of communications, new and faster means of communications are being utilized for conducting the business of foreign policy of state around the globe. New terminologies for public diplomacy, like soft power and branding, we have discussed about both these terminologies in our today's lecture. So I would not talk further about that, and I'll move forward with the next factor. So new public diplomacy strategy is based on people to people contact. So this strategy which should be followed in the new public diplomacy, it should heavily emphasize people to people contact. People to people contact should be given much consideration before making or formulating policies, or before formulating or and executing policies, both internally and externally. The next factor is the new public diplomacy strategy. Okay, we already have talked about that. New public diplomacy is described as relation building. So this public new public diplomacy is also compared with the relation building, in which states try to build their relationship with other countries by focusing on people to people contact, by having cross cultural exchanges, and by having academic student exchange programs, just to we can say to fasten the process of relationship building in a positive way. So these it's this new public diplomacy is also described as a relation building process. New thinking and new solutions are given chance to solve the problem. So we in our previous points we discussed that it is open and a slow process. So in because of the open nature of this new public diplomacy, the new thinkings and new solutions are given more chances because of the open nature of the new public diplomacy. And people concerned are tried to be given more consideration while resolving some issues between public and the governments, or between people to people conflicts. And the last one is the increased role of NGOs, supranational and subnational actors. As we are quite familiar with the expanding nature of states activity nowadays, and the business of state has encompassed a lot of new fields and dimensions in its scope. So the state's activity has expanded a lot, and it encompass it is comprised of both state and non-state actors. So because of the increasing role of NGOs and various other non-state actors, the new public diplomacy has come to a great significance. So this is all about today's discussion, and in our next lecture we would start with demarcating a difference between traditional public diplomacy and the 21st century public diplomacy. And then we will talk about the old and new diplomacy, public diplomacy, in a brief way. And next we will try to cover the goals and stages of public diplomacy. And finally we will talk about the actors and the challenges and the different prospects of public diplomacy for future. And that's how we will try to conclude this discussion about public diplomacy. So if you have any queries about this about today's lecture, feel free to ask your questions. You would be allowed to raise questions on the LMS system. I would try to upload this lecture both on the YouTube channel and on this LMS system. And when you will have access to the LMS system, you can raise questions over there, and I would be quite happy to answer your questions. And you can also raise your questions in the WhatsApp group which we have already created before. So wish you all the best, stay happy and healthy. Allah Hafiz. See you next for the next lecture.